Hi YouTube, Bane666 here. So I was looking at some other articles and one of them linked to this quiz as evidence for the connection between MRAs and Trump. Because apparently every one of the men's rights activists throughout the world, even the non-Americans, all voted for Trump. Every single one. So the point of the quiz is to determine who said these quotes, an MRA or Donald Trump. So as the quiz actually doesn't work and doesn't record your answers, I'll look these up as I go and find out whether they're said by an MRA or Donald Trump. So number one is, being friends with girls is a pathetic tactic losers use. Well, that's definitely not an MRA sentiment. I don't think it would be from Donald Trump either. I'm guessing it might be from Roosh V or Pickup Artists or something like that. It definitely sounds about their level of intellectual capacity. So let's do a search and find out. And we find the top result is 6 Reasons to Never Be Friends with Girls, Return of Kings. Yes, that notorious MRA site, Return of Kings, which writes articles telling men not to be men's rights activists. Yeah. Yeah. What a surprise. What a shock. Number 2. You know what? The women get it better than we do, folks. Well, is that something an MRA would say? Well, I guess in certain areas, women definitely do have it better. They're more likely to be believed if they're victims of sexual assault or domestic abuse. They're more likely to get services and help. They're more likely to get help if they're homeless, even though they're a minority. They have numerous government programs which spend a large amount of money on women's issues, whereas men's issues tend to be ignored. Need I mention the family court or criminal sentencing or a number of other things? So there are definitely areas where women get it better than men. Now, I don't know if I'd generalise and say that all women have it better than all men, though, because women have issues as well. So it's rather a simplistic statement. I'm going to say that would have been said by Trump. So let's do a search, and yes, it was said by Trump. So let's go on to number 3. A person who is very flat-chested is very hard to be a 10. Well, that's not something an MRA would say. I'm guessing that either came from Roosh V or possibly Trump. So let's do a search and see what we find. And it was Trump. Okay. Let's go on to number 4. These days, treating women the same as men gets you branded a misogynist. Now, there is some truth to this. I believe that men and women should have equal rights, as do other MRAs. We also believe, though, that women should have equal responsibility. Need I mention the sentencing gap yet again? If you do the crime, you should do equal time. That simple. And often trying to talk about the inequalities that affect men do get you branded a misogynist. So there is some truth to this. So this could have actually been said by an MRA. So let's do a search and see what we find. Now, the only source I could find for this comment was a random person leaving a comment on the Red Pill Reddit. So, yes, not a men's rights source at all, right? So far we haven't had a single MRA source. How interesting. I'm sure there'll be some later on, right? Yeah, sure. 5. All of the men were petrified to speak to women anymore. We may raise our voice. Okay, I'm guessing MGTOW. If I were to guess, I would say this is possibly MGTOW. Maybe Trump, I'm not sure. But MRAs are not petrified to speak to women. So let's do a search and see what we get. It's a Donald Trump quote. Okay. Number 6. Treat women as if they're emotional little children. They are, after all. This doesn't mean to abuse them or treat them poorly. It simply means to acknowledge the limits of their intellectual capacity. Now, this definitely isn't an MRA statement, and I can't imagine Trump saying something like this when he's running for the presidency. So I am going to guess that it is something from Return of Kings or Roosh V, because that sounds like the type of thing he would say. So let's do a search. Oh, and look at that. It's a Return of Kings article. What a surprise. Who's it written by? Just out of curiosity. Let's have a look. Oh, it wasn't Roosh V, but it's still Return of Kings. Close enough. Number 7. Women have one of the great acts of all time. The smart ones act very feminine and needy, but inside they are real killers. The person who came up with the expression the weaker sex was either very naive or had to be kidding. Once again, I'm guessing this is probably Return of Kings, if I had to guess. I don't think it's an MRA statement. I don't think it's Trump, although I could be wrong. Let's have a search and see what we find. Oh, it's a Donald Trump quote. Okay. So let's go on to 8. Women who falsely accuse men of rape should go to prison every time. Now, this actually does sound like an MRA statement. It's possible Trump has said it too. And it's something that anyone who believes in justice should believe in, actually. Now, obviously, you need due process and you need to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it is a false accusation. And there are plenty of cases where that's happened. And in those cases, the false accuser should go to jail. It should be used as a deterrent for people making false allegations. That's simple. So, I think this might actually come from an MRA site. I think this might be the only one so far to actually come from an MRA website, said by an actual MRA. So let's do a web search and see what we find. The only place I can find this quote is the quiz. That's interesting. Number 9. I like kids. I mean, I won't do anything to take care of them. I'll supply funds and she'll take care of the kids. Well, this definitely isn't an MRA statement, because we don't want men to be seen as walking wallets, and we encourage fathers to take part in their children's lives. So definitely not an MRA statement. Possibly something said by Trump. I don't think this would have come from Roosh V and Return of Kings, which seems to be where they're getting the majority of their false MRA statements from. So I'm guessing it's Donald Trump. And yeah, it's Donald Trump. So very, very anti-MRA statement from Donald Trump. Number 10. 26,000 unreported sexual assaults in the military. Only 238 convictions. Well, I guess if there's 26,000 unreported sexual assaults, you aren't going to get that many convictions, are you? You can't get a conviction if something is unreported. Clearly, they're not going to randomly just convict people. Well, at least I hope they're not. It goes on to say, what did these geniuses expect when they put men and women together? Well, I don't think that's something an MRA would say. I don't think that's in line with the men's rights movement. Once again, it could be Return of Kings. Although, do they actually go into stats and things like that? So, it's also possibly said by Trump. So, I'm going either Return of Kings or Donald Trump. Definitely not an MRA. So, let's do a search and see what we get. Oh, and it's Donald Trump. So, out of the 10 statements, there was not a single one made by a men's rights activist. Not a single one. Why am I not surprised? Okay, so let's continue with the what's wrong with men's rights debate, so-called debate. And up next is Peter Lloyd, who makes some pretty good arguments. I have very, very few faults to pick with his arguments. There is one or two, however. So I'm not going to interrupt him too much, and when I do, it's only going to be minor things. Let's get stuck into it.
Okay, so if you heckle, I just won't take you in the questions. So that's the deal that we've got. Great introduction. Thank you so much. Kicked things off brilliantly. Peter.
Wow. Well, thank you for that warm introduction. It's interesting. As part of my preparation for this, I was speaking to Queen Camille Parlier last night at the bar. And I had a revelation. I realized that not only is Camille one of the world's greatest thinkers, she's also one of the world's greatest drinkers. And so if I'm a bit green around the gills today, please accept my apologies. But the important thing was that she totally gets it. She gets the men's rights movement, which is interesting because a lot of people don't. If you speak to many feminists, you will hear a familiar mantra that men are privileged, always have been, always will be, and that women are victims, always have been, always will be. But the data, which is empirical and impartial, paints a very different, inconvenient picture. We pay the most taxes, we get the least state support, we've become an educational underclass, and we have a record high suicide rate. We're also more likely to be homeless, attacked, jailed, drafted, denied parental rights, and shafted by divorce courts. And on top of that, as if that wasn't enough fun, we also die years earlier than we need to because of the life expectancy gap, which has grown 90% in 100 years. And that's because, not because men don't go to the doctors, but because the NHS spend millions and millions and millions of pounds on women's healthcare, which is great. But they don't spend hardly anything on men's healthcare, which is surely not equal. Despite all this, there is fierce, sometimes violent resistance to the suggestion of a men's minister or marking International Men's Day in Parliament. We saw this with Philip Davies, MP, recently. When he mooted the idea of having a debate in Parliament, Jess Phillips laughed at all of the aforementioned problems. Apparently that's funny. And so this is precisely why we need meninism.
Oh, dude, you were doing so very, very well there, right up until you said this is why we need meninism. Now, I've criticised a lot of feminists for conflating the men's rights movement and meninism together as if they're the same thing. Meninism is a parody of feminism. The men's rights movement is a human rights movement. The two things are not the same. It's disappointing that Peter Lloyd does not know that after making such great arguments so far. Now, I guess it's only a minor thing considering his arguments have been good, but, you know, fair's fair. I call out feminists for making this point, so I have to call him out too. And it's disappointing that he doesn't know the difference. But anyway, continue, Peter.
Or, as I prefer, being a suffragette. Despite 50 years of feminism being the political and social status quo, it hasn't done anything to address any of the aforementioned issues. It doesn't touch them. It doesn't care. And that's because the patriarchy theory, which is just a theory, it's not a fact, paints men as the aggressors, as the opponents who must be defeated. So why on earth would feminists want to help them? This means that men, I take no joy in saying this, but it's the truth, men who support feminism are turkeys voting for Christmas. Now look, this doesn't mean that the men's movement is misogynistic, as Lydia suggested it is. As many people suggested it, it's very easy to go into forums, the dark corners of the internet, and quote mine and find vile comments from vile people, or conflate the actions of mentally ill people like Elliot Rodgers with people like me, who is largely sane. It's simply about men being active and trying to address some issues. One of my all-time favorite things about the men's movement, which a lot of people conveniently ignore, is that it's heavily populated with women. There are amazing women in the men's rights movement. Camille Parlier, Christina Hoff Sommers from the American Enterprise Institute, Cassie J, a film director, she's just made a film called The Red Pill. Erin Pizzey, you were talking about the domestic violence issues. Erin Pizzey was famously ousted by the feminist movement. She was given threats. She was forced to leave the country because she refused to uphold the dogma that only men are violent and all women are victims. So, yes, we do need meninism. We do need men's rights.
I did it again. He said meninism again. And look, fair's fair. I pointed out to Lydia in my last video that it was Elliot Rodger, not Elliot Rogers. So I guess I should point out to Peter Lloyd the same point. It's Elliot Rodger. And I would have liked Peter to make the point that Elliot Rodger had no connection to the men's rights movement at all, considering that was such a large talking point from Lydia. But I'm guessing he might actually believe the propaganda. He probably hasn't seen people like myself debunk it. So he's probably just swallowed the propaganda put out by feminists, which would be disappointing, but it wouldn't entirely be surprising. Anyway, continue.
But men's rights doesn't need to be at the expense of women's rights. And all I would say is, you know, you don't take my word for it. You can take Camille Parlier's word for it too. It's I like the idea that we could all just work together with like a slightly universalist approach than this divisive, gender-baiting propaganda that we hear all the time, which is quite clearly from the last 50 years, getting us nowhere.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, so let's continue with Rationalwiki and their look at men's rights talking points, or their version of our talking points. So this time we're looking at reproductive rights and mandated child support.
Summarized as, if you have the right to abort with or without my consent, I have the right not to pay for the child.
Well, in America, for example, this is a little bit more complex because women have an option, which is called the Baby Moses laws or the safe haven laws, depending on where you are.
You do have a choice. If you feel you cannot take care of your newborn baby, Louisiana's safe haven law allows you to anonymously leave your newborn up to 30 days old with an employee at a safe haven facility, such as a hospital, police, or fire station, with no questions asked.
And basically a woman can take her baby and anonymously leave the child at a fire station or wherever the drop-off point is in that state. Now, I think in some states they're meant to get permission from the father, but considering it's anonymous, I'm not exactly sure how you would get permission from the father or prove that you've had permission from the father.
Safe haven laws trample due process for fathers. Last week, a 2-week-old baby girl was found in a pile of trash in the Chicago suburb Franklin Park. This, despite the fact that Illinois has a safe haven law. Nearly every state in America has a safe haven law that allows mothers to abandon their children at designated hospitals, fire stations, or police stations and just walk away from their responsibilities as a parent. There are no legal ramifications or accountability for the mother and few, if any, questions asked. Most importantly, where is the child's father? In most cases, the father is probably unaware of the child as well as the ultimate fate of his child. With the built-in anonymity that safe haven laws afford the mother, there is very little chance that the father will ever be contacted so that he can pursue custody and care for his child and be afforded due process and equal protection under the U.S. Constitution. The irony in the safe haven laws lies with continued gender bias that surrounds the rights of fathers. When a father chooses to opt out of parenthood and just walk away from his paternal responsibilities, he becomes a deadbeat dad, or worse, he goes to jail for failing to live up to his financial responsibilities. Yet, When a mother decides that she will not take care of her child, she is given anywhere from 78 hours to 18 years, in some states, to safely abandon her child. Unlike a traditional adoption, the father does not have to be notified, does not have to legally relinquish his parental rights, and the child is denied a chance to grow up with dad or members of his biological family. A father's lack of knowledge of the existence of his child or the intentions of the mother to abandon the child is not grounds for termination of a father's legal rights as a parent. The very nature of the law erodes the importance of the American family and the values we place on it. While the safe haven laws were born out of good intentions, the problems that they have created outweigh the benefits, especially when mothers continue to abandon their children in dangerous and life-threatening ways. Lawmakers and legislators are torn on how to fix the law so that they protect the child while still affording the father parental rights and safeguards to claim and raise his child. Most states have created putative father registries to afford fathers notice. However, these registries are pointless if the mother's identity is not established and the fathers are not provided actual notice. Also, the fact that these registries exist is not known to the public at large.
So, even if a woman doesn't have an abortion, she still has total control over if she wants to be a parent or not. And not only over whether she wants to be a parent or not, but also whether the father is going to be a parent or not. If he doesn't want to be a parent, too bad. If she wants to be one, he's still responsible, right? But if she doesn't want to be responsible, if she's not ready, she can either have an abortion or leave the child at a safe haven. Too bad if he wants to be a father. Next.
Men do not have any right to force a woman to have an abortion or carry the child to term.
And nor should they. I don't think men should be able to force a woman to have an abortion or anything like that. That's crazy. Now, we often talk about a financial abortion, which is probably a bad term. A better term is parental surrender, and that is where a parent gives up their right to the child. Once again, this is exactly the right that women have when it comes to the safe haven laws, but men do not have this right. Now, someone may point out in the comment section that men can go through the legal system and do it, but my understanding is they need permission from the mother, and it's a very complex thing. It's a lot more complex than just leaving a child anonymously at the local fire station without the permission of the father. Two totally different things. And I think in the vast majority of cases, the mother isn't going to give that permission, because that would mean that she's no longer getting child support. Now, I guess I should bring up one other thing here, and this is, I guess, an interesting point that isn't relevant now, but might be relevant in decades to come, and that is the artificial womb. Now, when a woman wants to have an abortion, there's basically two arguments used by pro-choice people, and that is, it's her body, therefore it's her choice, and I would agree with that. And the second one is, if she's not ready to be a parent, she shouldn't be forced to be a parent, which I think is fair. I'm just asking for men to have that same right. Now, imagine in 10 or 20 years' time, they finally figure out how to get the artificial womb working perfectly. And for the sake of argument, let's say that removing a fetus is no more difficult than giving a woman an abortion. So the woman's not going to go through any more trauma or any more of a complex operation than she would if she's just having an abortion. Now, I don't know if this would actually be the case, obviously, but let's imagine that's the case for the sake of argument. So imagine we have a situation where a mother isn't ready to be a mother. She doesn't want to be a mother, so she wants to have an abortion. But the father wants to keep the child. Now the question is, should we remove that fetus and put it in an artificial womb? And if we did that, would the mother be financially responsible for the child? We've essentially removed the her body, her choice argument. So now it just comes down to the I'm not ready to be a parent argument. And I suspect under those circumstances, feminists would still support the notion that if the mother is not ready to be a parent, then she shouldn't have to be. And she shouldn't be forced to be a parent, which is, exactly what we're arguing for men at the moment. So it might be an interesting time in 10 or 20 years if they can figure out that technology. But at the moment, the argument is somewhat lopsided because it is the woman's body, so it should be her choice. But that argument really doesn't hold that much water when there are still options for the woman after the child is born. Options that men don't have. That's not equality. Next.
However, because women hold this right in full, men must have a right to declare a desire to opt out of child support.
Well, it's more than just opting out of child support, it's opting out of parenthood. So that parent would have no right to that child thereafter, just like the baby Moses laws or the safe haven laws. This is an option that women already have in the US. Men aren't asking for anything special, any special treatment or anything like that. They're just asking for exactly the same rights that women already have under the safe haven laws. In fact, men are asking for less rights because they still wouldn't have the right to take the child from the mother and anonymously leave it at a safe haven without the permission of the mother, which is something that mothers have. So even if we get what we're asking for, it still wouldn't be equal. So Rationalwiki's explanation of our talking points is fairly accurate but rather simplistic. But let's have a look at their rebuttal to us.
It's debatable whether forced child support is good or bad in the general case, whether the freedom for a father to choose not to have to pay child support is worth having the child grow up poor if the mother doesn't abort. It is something that isn't studied nearly as much as it should be.
Now, once again, safe haven laws is the answer to this. If you think that men should be responsible for their children and pay child support and shouldn't be able to opt out, then surely you should be arguing against the safe haven laws, which, to my knowledge, feminists don't do. I don't recall ever hearing a feminist talk about the safe haven laws and say, well, it's not in the best interest of the child. It seems the pecking order is women's choice first and then the best interest of the child, and then right down the bottom is the options for men, which are next to zero. And that's hardly equality. If you're going to argue the point that the child's best interest should be above everything, then you should be arguing that the safe haven laws need to go. Although technically the reason they were brought in was to stop mothers from killing their children, unwanted children. But, that's a whole other argument. Next.
However, one must note that the largest burden for childcare, in terms of time and money, is on women when there is an unwanted pregnancy.
Okay, time, I'll give you time, but, they've chosen to have that child, so that's the price they have to pay, right? If you choose to have children, they're going to eat up a lot of time. As for money, I would say, when it comes to money, that most of the burden on raising children is either on the father or the state. If you have a situation where it is a deadbeat dad, then the state steps in, at least in the Western world, most of the Western world. I know it's not exactly the same everywhere. Next.
If a woman feels compelled to have the child for religious or social reasons, that child was still the product of two persons, and the simple fact that she can opt out, whether she chooses to or not, does not abdicate a man's responsibility.
Yeah, okay, so it takes two people to create a child, and therefore both the mother and father should be responsible when the child is born. Okay, are you arguing against the safe haven laws? Where are all the feminist protests saying, mothers need to be responsible for their children? I'm not hearing it. So it makes it hard to take this argument seriously. And secondly, if we're going to say it takes two people to create a child, therefore the father should be responsible, then surely the family court should give fathers more rights, right? More responsibility, more custody, more visitation, instead of just the financial burden. Fathers are seen as a wallet, that's it, by the courts and by a lot of people. If you are going to argue that fathers need to take responsibility, then they need the benefits as well. But it seems that when people argue things like this, what they actually mean is the mother should have all the responsibility as the parent, and the father should take all the financial burden, and that's it. And that's bullshit. That's not equality. Next.
While a truly reliable, temporary male birth control is not yet available, men do have options, including using condoms and getting vasectomies.
Yeah, but vasectomies are an operation. Now, it's not a major operation, but it is still a procedure, and it's not always reversible. You know, that's the type of thing you have if you don't want any kids at all, or if you've already had your kids and you don't want any more. It's really not a temporary form of birth control. You know, if you're 20 and you want to have kids when you're 35, you're not going to get a vasectomy as a form of birth control, right? And condoms, I highly recommend people use condoms, especially if it's with someone you don't know or know that well. But they can still break, and they're not perfect, and accidents can still happen. And the point is, though, that women have vastly more forms of birth control than men, yet somehow they still accidentally get pregnant. Now, I know the birth control pill isn't perfect, and some medication can interfere with it, and, you know, other things can interfere with it. Sometimes it doesn't work the way it's meant to. I get that. But then again, sometimes these accidents aren't really accidents, are they? But we're about to talk about that next.
That said, there are very, very few cases where a woman stole a man's sperm and impregnated herself with it. And in at least one of those cases, the man was then forced to pay child support.
Now, I would agree that it is probably fairly rare that a woman would fish out a condom from a bin and insert it into herself to get pregnant. Now, that has definitely happened. I don't think that happens that often. However, a woman saying that she's on the pill when she's not, or forgetting to take the pill because she wants to become pregnant, that's a lot easier, isn't it? And unfortunately, we don't have any stats on that, but I would love to see some. I would love to see how many accidental pregnancies are actually accidental pregnancies. Now, I'm not saying all women do this. I'm not even saying the majority of women do this, but I think we would be a bit shocked at the numbers, especially when women are getting older and their biological clock is ticking and they're running out of options and getting a bit desperate to have a child. It becomes a lot easier to accidentally forget to take their pill. So what is a man meant to do in that situation? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's a couple, they've been in a relationship for a long time, she's on birth control. Is he meant to insist on using condoms? What exactly would she think if he insisted on using condoms when she's on the pill? I'm guessing a lot of women would think that he's been cheating and has caught something nasty from someone else and doesn't want to give it to her, or that he doesn't trust her. And in some cases, that would be the rational thing to think. So men are really putting a lot of blind trust in their partners when it comes to birth control. And some women will abuse that. That's simple. Next.
There are also documented instances of women becoming pregnant through statutory rape, and in one case that other courts in the United States have cited as precedent, a panel of judges held a 12-year-old whose babysitter molested him responsible for child support. In those cases, at least, the man probably should have some form of protection or choice. But they are rare outliers and shouldn't affect the debate much.
Well, a woman becoming pregnant because she's molested a 12-year-old, yeah, those cases are probably rare. I mean, although there seems to be a lot of teachers sleeping with their students. I know at least some of them have become pregnant. I don't know if it's common for them to become pregnant, though. But what I previously mentioned about someone just forgetting to take their birth control pill accidentally on purpose, I don't think that is a rare outlier. I don't think the majority of women are doing it, but at the same time, I don't think it's exactly rare. Next.
Oh, And there's also the issue of putting the baby up for adoption.
Yes, so the safe haven law is essentially a form of adoption, but it's one where the mother decides for both parents, which I hope anyone who is actually interested in any form of equality would see as being fucked up and unfair. Now, an interesting thing is that feminist Karen DeCrow was fighting for men to have the option of opting out of parenthood way back in the 80s. And I see Karen DeCrow as one of the good feminists. She was one of the feminists I could respect. And she agreed with the MRA position. She went to court and fought for a man to have the option to opt out of parenthood after his wife had become pregnant by an accident.
There was a case, the Serpico case. You might be too young to know the movie Serpico with Al Pacino. It was about a New York City undercover cop. He gets shot at the end of the movie and retires from the police force. And he was a real man, Frank Serpico. A woman after the movie, after this was made, decided she wanted to become a single mother and tricked him into fathering a child. And the court accepted that because she told her friends she was going to trick him, and they testified. And the court said, yes, you were tricked into it. And still awarded her over 90% of his police pension. So everything that he goes through in this movie to including getting shot to earn his pension, she won by sleeping with him one night.
Okay, 3 quick things before moving on to the next segment. Firstly, I said just a little while ago in this segment that I'd love to see some statistics for the number of women who have accidentally become pregnant due to forgetting to take their birth control pill. And after I'd recorded that and done the animation and some video editing, it suddenly occurred to me that I'd come across some figures which might give us some indication of how common or uncommon that is. Now remember, Rationalwiki says that this is exceptionally rare and almost never happens, and we shouldn't even consider it. So let's have a look at some figures from the CDC. And this is from the prevalence of control of reproductive or sexual health by an intimate partner. So the first set of figures we'll look at is women who are reporting on their male partners. So the percentage of women who have had a male partner who tried to get them pregnant when they did not want to or refused to use a condom is 8.6%. So what would that be? Off the top of my head, I think that would be 1 in 12 or 1 in 11 or something like that. Okay, so let's look at the figures for males. And it turns out to be roughly 10.4% of males. So that's roughly 1 in 10. I would not say 1 in 10 is a rare event. Now, a couple of things to point out about this. Firstly, these are attempts. So we can't conclude that every attempt results in a pregnancy. So it would be wrong to conclude that 10% of pregnancies are due to men being tricked into impregnating women. But at the same time, we can't conclude that every man has detected every attempt. So the number would have to be far greater than 10%. If a woman suddenly stops taking her birth control pill, it's unlikely that her husband or boyfriend is going to know, unless for some strange reason he keeps track of the pills she takes, which is exceptionally unlikely. So we don't know the exact figures, but I think that gives us some indication that it's not exactly rare, as Rationalwiki would like us to believe. And obviously it's a much bigger issue than a lot of people think. The next thing I should mention is the Putative Father Registry, which was mentioned in one of the articles I went through earlier. So I think it's only fair that we have a little bit of a closer look at that because it's really relevant to the safe haven laws.
In the United States, putative fathers will be notified when an action to terminate their parental rights as part of adoption proceedings are filed for a child they may have fathered and registered for. They are not guaranteed any rights in contesting the decision by the mother, nor are they guaranteed the ability to adopt or gain custody of the child. Typically, the father is only guaranteed notification and the right to appear in court to testify about their child's best interests. There is no federal law in place regulating putative father registries. Among all signatory countries, only the United States refuses to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and registries are not regulated under the UN Charter. Currently 33 states in the U.S. have putative father registries. Unknown is the number of children adopted without consent or notice to the biological father under the registry program started in the 1970s. The Putative Father Registry is supposedly intended to provide legal recognition to the putative father of a child, provided he registers within a limited time frame, usually any time prior to the birth or from 1 to 31 days after a birth. Lack of knowledge of the pregnancy or birth is not an acceptable reason for failure to file. Some states require a putative father to file with multiple states, that is, with the state possible conception might have occurred, state of residence if different, and possible states the female might visit or relocate to after the possible conception date that also have putative father registries. To be valid, at least one state requires a parent or guardian of the declarant to also sign when a minor under the age of 18 is documenting intercourse with a putative father registry. 17 states, Alaska, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Mississippi, Nevada, New Jersey, North Carolina, North Dakota, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Washington, West Virginia, as well as American Samoa, District of Columbia, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, do not have putative father registries.
I started to research some fathers' rights issues and came across some harrowing stories. Like this man in South Carolina who found out his only daughter was adopted away by the mother without his knowledge or consent.
His daughter was with an adoptive family in California, so he began his fight to get his daughter back.
Adoption is for children without families, not children with a willing and capable family.
And this man in Colorado who lost his daughter when the mother left the state to give birth in Utah, where he wouldn't have legal rights to his child. He fought for 4 years in court and finally won visitation rights. Only visitation.
So we hear all the time that fathers need to take responsibility for their kids, but really fathers have very, very limited rights to their own children. It's amazing how they're expected to take responsibility when they're lacking so many rights. I mean, the father registry thing is crazy. You're meant to go and register in all these different states, just in case the mother of the child wants to adopt the child out without your knowledge or permission. And it's not advertised, so a lot of people don't even know about these registries. So we have a situation where the mother chooses parenthood not only for herself, but for the father as well. If she wants to be a parent, then he has to be responsible, no matter what. Doesn't matter if he's not interested, doesn't matter if he doesn't want to be a father, doesn't matter if he was tricked into getting her pregnant. None of that matters, right? We have to look after the best interest of the child because the mother wants to be a mother. But if she doesn't want to be a mother, then the best interest of the child is thrown out the window. The father's rights to be a father and to be a parent are just thrown away because she doesn't want to be a parent, so she can choose for both of them. This is bullshit. This isn't equality. Now you may be saying, but Bain, this is just the US, and yeah, sure, it's pretty bad, but the rest of the world isn't like that. Well, that's not exactly true. In numerous places, they have things like the baby hatches. They have these in Germany and Poland and the Czech Republic, and a lot of places across Europe. They even have a couple in Canada. There's 2 in Edmonton. And other places like my home of Australia have been discussing whether we should have them as well. So it's not just an American thing. And once again, when a mother can just take her child and leave it in a box at a hospital or in a fire station or whatever, anonymously, then we don't know what the wishes of the father are. We have no idea whether he wanted to be a parent or not. The choice is taken out of his hands entirely. He has no choice or no options. And I have to wonder, how exactly is this equality?
With that reunion we mentioned between a soldier and his daughter, this is not the usual story. They were not separated by war, but instead by the girl's mom, who put her up for adoption without telling the father. ABC's Tanya Rivero is here with this story. Good morning.
Good morning, Dan. The battle for custody of his daughter with the family who thought they had adopted her dragged on for a bitter 22 months, most of the little girl's life, but it made the homecoming for soldier Terry Achane and his daughter all the sweeter. Reunited at last, this adorable toddler and her father can now start a new life together.
I'm just happy right now. I'm with my daughter. It's about time.
A happy ending to the nightmare that began 2 years ago when soldier Terry Achane says his wife secretly gave their daughter up for adoption while he was out of state on active duty. And the Utah family who adopted the little girl at birth fought Achane bitterly to keep her. The Frys, who have 5 other children, claimed he'd abandoned his family and mounted a tough legal battle for which they raised over $22,000 on their blog.
Okay, so let's have a look at the third speaker from the What's Wrong with Men's Rights debate. This is another feminist. She's not as bad as Lydia was, but I still have some major issues with some of the things she says. So let's get stuck into it.
Angela.
I think it's possibly more useful to think of the men's rights movement in terms of where people within it are coming from philosophically. Because if we get into, sort of, he said this and then he said that kind of stuff, a lot of the time people who speak online are going to be incoherent. So I think thinking of it in terms of the broader kind of principles is useful. So, for example, I'm a feminist, but I would absolutely unequivocally support every and all goals of the men's rights movement that seek equality before the law. I mean, to me, it should be kind of self-evident. For example, in the family courts, I don't see any reason why feminists or people who regard themselves as progressive on gender would not support the men's rights movement, particularly in the family courts, because of the fact that, historically it was feminists who said, women are not exclusively, destined by biology or God to be the caretakers.
Yet we find many feminists who do exactly that. They are not for shared custody. They actively stand against it, some of the organisations being quite large and mainstream, and basically they're putting the mother's right to choose whether she wants custody or not ahead of the father's rights to be a parent. Now this relates back to the previous segment in many ways. But there are definitely many feminists standing in the way of equality when it comes to the family court.
And to raise children. So it's completely incoherent of them to try to stop in some way fathers from actually trying to be part of the family. So I support all of that. I have absolutely no problem with that. Lydia mentioned the online stuff. Now, I've written about that a bit, but I accept that you have to make a distinction between the people who are making the very fair equality before the law arguments and those who are just kind of stalking people and harassing people and so on.
Yes, but unfortunately anyone who is seen as a harasser or a stalker or a troll or whatever is automatically classed as an MRA by people like Lydia. That's a major part of the problem.
The people who are behaving in that way, I think, should be more perhaps vocally condemned by those who are fair-minded within the men's rights movement, because I don't accept that they're pro-free speech, for example, because they absolutely terrorise anyone who questions them.
Yeah, the thing is, the MRM is constantly distancing itself from people who are not MRAs but are falsely called MRAs. Two perfect examples of this are Roosh V and Peter Andrew Nolan. Both clearly state that they're not MRAs, and MRAs criticise them constantly. Yet we have dishonest journalists who constantly claim that they're mainstream MRAs and they're prominent MRAs and they're representative of the men's rights movement. And when we point out that they're not, the counter-argument usually is, oh, but they use all the same arguments that MRAs use, which is bullshit. But if they use all the same arguments that MRAs use, then why not use MRAs using those arguments? It should be pretty simple, right? Of course, these journalists don't, because Roosh and Peter Andrew Nolan don't use all the same arguments.
And I just don't think they're very progressive. One of the ways I think, elements within the men's rights movement are not progressive is that I feel they're actually mimicking the worst strands within feminism itself, because they're trying to get in on the kind of victim game.
Now, this is where she starts to get really fucking offensive. She starts to make the argument that because men's rights activists are trying to bring attention to men's issues, it's somehow men whining and not being masculine enough, and men should be men and stoic, and all that shit that we constantly get criticised for by other feminists. And apparently we should just, shut up about our issues because that makes us whiny like feminists. Men should just man up and get on with it, right? I'm sure that has nothing to do with the incredibly high male suicide rate. Now, this is a very complex issue, and it's one I've been meaning to tackle for quite some time. I've got all the pieces in my head, I just haven't got around to getting them out yet, because it's going to be rather complex. So I'm not going to go into an extensive rebuttal right here. I'll save that for a video dedicated just to that, to men and their emotions and dealing with issues. But the short answer is, this really pisses me off. Men wanting to talk about the high male suicide rate is not men playing victim or being whiny. It's a real fucking issue that needs to be talked about. Telling men just to man up and get on with it isn't a solution. Are you suggesting that newborn baby boys have their genitals mutilated because they're not manly enough? Maybe those babies should just stop crying about it when they have their genitals mutilated, right? It's really fucking offensive. Especially when feminists go on about things like manspreading and air conditioning being sexist.
I came across a wonderful piece of footage from I think it's from the late 90s, and it's Christopher Hitchens, Naomi Wolf, and a very young Katie Royfey, whose book about kind of sex panic on campus, which is now more relevant than ever, had just come out. And Christopher Hitchens said something that was kind of eerily prophetic, and it was this. This is the next thing that's going to happen. The infantilizing that we're talking about is going to happen. Men will say, well, if a woman can go to the dean because they've been felt up or whatever, I'm going to start doing it too.
Yeah, but men aren't going to the dean saying that they've been felt up. They're being kicked out of fucking universities without due process. They're being put in front of kangaroo courts, where evidence is being suppressed, and the testimony of the accuser is enough to get them kicked out of the university. I suppose they're just moaning and crying about that too, right?
Everyone is going to start playing the victim. Men will want to share in the victimhood business, and it will be unstoppable and completely negative and very boring. And I think that's a really good description of a lot of what is happening. I was also reminded of something kind of seemingly unrelated, but it did pop into my head when I was preparing for this, which was one time years ago I was watching Question Time, and the discussion was about English national identity. And David Starkey was on the panel, and he said, I might not get this exactly right because I'm just working from memory, but it was something like this. Once we start having state-sponsored Morris dancing and all that kind of thing, we, the English, will be no better than the Irish and the Welsh. And the reason I thought of that was because I thought, in some weird way, once you start sort of, and I know we're doing this right now, but once men start sort of gathering around and talking about masculinity and talking about their feelings and, kind of essentially mimicking precisely what a feminist meeting is like.
No. We don't blame all our issues on the other gender. You've got that very wrong. We are nothing like a feminist meeting.
Kind of the game is over in some way. Stoicism is kind of part of the package of masculinity. And I would also say it's actually a very positive trait of masculinity, which all the women I admire and all the women who made feminism happen were actually, embodying in some way.
I would agree to some extent that it can be a positive trait, but it comes at a great cost. Once again, all you have to do is look at the high male suicide rate to see what cost it comes at. Now, as I said earlier, this is a very complex issue, and I have the intentions of doing a much longer, detailed video talking about the nuances. So I'll leave the detailed response until then.
Not just stoicism, but all the other kind of masculine virtues, physical bravery, strength, all of the women I admire, Bernadette Devlin, Joanne Greer, that's the kind of spirit in which they actually brought about really positive changes for women. And I just think let's not leave those great masculine virtues just to the men. I think we should sort of raise everyone up by actually, making people stronger rather than expanding the kind of the very negative cult of victimhood that we see emerging, that I think is actually extremely negative for women, and I think it will also be very negative for men.
If MRAs were talking about the female version of manspreading and mansplaining, and we were saying that air conditioning is sexist because offices are too cold, and therefore men are oppressed, or whatever bullshit that we constantly hear from the feminist movement, then I would agree with her, and I probably would stop using the MRA label if it couldn't be redeemed. But we're not doing that. We're trying to talk about serious issues like male suicide, about male victims of domestic abuse, fathers' rights. These aren't trivial issues where men are just whining about nonsense. Peter Lloyd, apart from calling men's rights activists meninist, made some excellent points. I mean, he clearly wasn't just whining and trying to play the victim card. So, and this is incredible coming from a feminist. I mean, all they fucking do is talk about trivial shit. How everything is oppression to them. I just don't see how you can compare the two things. It's astounding. It really is. Not to mention fucking offensive.
Oklahoma father says he will stop his custody battle for his little girl. Dustin Brown spoke publicly for the first time today since turning over his daughter Veronica to her adoptive parents. So you can imagine he held back tears in a press conference, saying he just couldn't take it anymore and loved Veronica too much to keep her in the spotlight.
Never ever for 1 second doubt how much I love you. How hard I fought for you, or how much you mean to me. My home will always be your home, and always welcome in it. I miss you more than words can express. You'll always be my little girl, my princess, and I will always love you until the day I die.
Heartbreaking to hear him today, and Brown's attorney is also asking Veronica's adoptive parents to drop the contempt of court proceedings and to use their influence to also have the state of South Carolina drop any criminal charges as well.